She stood in a hall full of people who knew her name, and not one of them was looking at her. 62 years old, 40 years a Luna. A woman who had memorized the name of every servant in a castle that was never hers, who had kept alliances intact with quiet hands and quieter words, who had planted lavender in a courtyard she was not allowed to call home. And now a scribe was reading a document aloud in a flat, procedural voice, and the document was the rest of her life being folded up and handed back to her like something that hadn't fit. The absence of pure royal bloodline. She had heard that sentence her whole life. She heard it now the way you hear a door closing, not the slam, just the soft and final click of something that will not be opened again. Her son did not look at her. Her daughter-in-law smiled. She signed her name and walked out. That was the part everyone saw. What no one saw, what no one knew to watch for, was what happened 60 miles south, in a field that had been waiting for 40 years, in the soil of a land her grandmother had left her with one whispered instruction she had never fully understood. When you come back, plant something living. The ground will do the rest. She did not know, driving south on a rattling cart with 2 trunks and a lavender cutting and nothing left to perform, that something older than the kingdom was waking up beneath the earth. She did not know that a man had been in a field nearby for 12 years, living quietly, keeping his word to a woman he had never expected to outlive. She did not know that the moment she pressed her hands into the soil of Ashvale, a thread of silver light would move south through the roots, straight and certain as a compass needle, toward the life she had always been meant to find. She thought she was going home to be alone. She had no idea she was going home to begin. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The hall smelled of pine resin and old ambition. Callus had learned over the course of 62 years that certain smells carried memories the way rivers carry silt. Quietly, without asking permission, pine resin meant the Great Hall of Thornmere Keep, and the Great Hall meant judgment. She stood at the far end of the long stone corridor, her fingers laced together at her waist, her spine pulled straight by decades of practiced dignity. The silver in her hair caught the torchlight and held it, not like a crown, but like a confession. She was old. She had always been old here, even when she was young. The doors at the end of the hall were open. Through them, she could hear the low murmur of voices, her son Evander's voice, smooth and rehearsed, the way it always sounded when he was performing rather than speaking. Her daughter-in-law Sarah's laughter, bright and cutting as a winter wind. And beneath it all, the measured silence of King Haldor himself, the Alpha King who had taken Callus as his Luna 40 years ago. Not out of love, but out of necessity. She had always known that. She had simply chosen, for 40 years, to build something real inside of a necessity. Her hands tightened. Don't let them see you flinch, she told herself. You have walked this hall 1,000 times. You can walk it once more. She walked. The great hall opened before her like a wound. Torches lined the walls in iron brackets, their light falling in long amber stripes across the stone floor. At the far end, on a raised dais, sat King Haldor, tall, even-seated, his dark hair now threaded with silver at the temples, his jaw as hard and certain as the mountains that surrounded Thornmere. He was not a cruel man. That, Callus had always thought, was the most complicated part. He was not cruel. He was simply convinced, in the deep and immovable way that powerful men sometimes are, that he had always been right. Evander stood to the king's left, his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral. He had his father's jaw and his father's certainty, but none of his father's occasional moments of doubt. He had looked at Callus the same way since he was a child, with a mild, practiced embarrassment, as though she were a piece of furniture that did not quite match the rest of the room. Sarah stood beside him, and she was the only one in the hall who smiled, That smile was the most dangerous thing in the room. "Mother." Evander's voice was formal, not cold. He was too careful for cold. Just formal, in the way that draws a line without appearing to draw one. "The king asked that you be present for the reading of the settlement." The settlement. Such a clean word for such a final thing. Callus moved down the center of the hall. She kept her eyes forward. She could feel the weight of the court, the advisors flanking the walls, the lesser nobles who had come to witness, the ancient scribe seated at the side table with his parchment already unrolled. She had stood before courts before. She had stood before this one and smiled and said the right things, and poured the right wine and greeted the right visitors for 40 years. She reached the center of the room and stopped. King Haldor looked at her. His expression was not cruel. It was something worse. It was the expression of a man who has already decided, who is not troubled by the deciding, and who has the patience to wait while the world adjusts itself around his conclusion. "Callus," he said. His voice was quiet. It always had been. That was one of the things she had once admired, the way he never needed to raise it. "You understand why we are here." She did not phrase it as a question. She would not give him the performance of her understanding. "You may read the document," she said instead. The scribe cleared his throat, a small, papery sound in the large stone room, and began. The language was formal. Ancient pack law woven through with newer kingdom codes, each clause interlocking with the next like stones in a wall. 40 years of marriage, dissolved. The lands of her birth, the countryside holding of Ashvale, where she had grown up before the arrangement was made, returned to her as sole property. A modest monthly allowance, sufficient but not generous. No title. No rights to the Thornmere name. No seat at any future council. And then the clause that the scribe read in the same dry, even tone as all the others, as though it were simply one more administrative detail. Given the absence of pure royal bloodline inheritance on the part of the Luna, and in recognition of the kingdom's obligation to secure legitimate succession, King Haldor of Thornmere hereby formally revokes the bond of Luna, effective upon the next full moon, in accordance with the right of severance. The absence of pure royal bloodline. Callus had heard that phrase her entire life. She had heard it whispered at her first presentation to the court at 22, a girl from a countryside holding with good instincts and steady hands but no ancient noble blood in her veins. She had heard it murmured at every feast when she did not shift with the same power as the born wolves, when her omega nature made her smaller, quieter, less impressive in a hall built for impressive things. She had heard it spoken more openly as the years passed, and the dynasty required heirs with lineage that hers could not provide. She had heard it. She had carried it. She had built a life inside of it anyway. Stone by stone, in the spaces where love had not grown, she had planted something quieter. Competence, loyalty, care, a well-run household, a kingdom whose people she had learned by name. None of that was in the document. Evander was looking at his hands. Sarah was still smiling. The court was very still. Callus breathed in through her nose, pine resin and old stone, and the faint ghost of the lavender she had grown in the courtyard garden for 30 years. And she breathed out slowly. "Is there anything you wish to say before the signing?" Haldor asked. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the face she had slept beside for 40 years, the face she had once tried to love and had eventually simply accepted, the face that had never once looked at her the way the old songs described. "No," she said. "Nothing I wish to say here." She walked to the table. She signed her name in the place the scribe indicated, Callus, just the one name, because the Thornmere name had never truly been hers anyway. She set the quill down without a sound. She turned. She walked back through the hall the same way she had entered, with her spine straight and her hands still and her face composed. She did not allow herself to feel the full weight of it until she had passed through the outer doors and was standing alone in the courtyard, where the wind moved through the lavender in long, slow waves. The moon was 3 days from full. She could feel it in her blood the way omegas always could. A low, persistent pull, like a tide that had never quite stopped. 3 days until the rite of severance was complete. 3 days until she was no longer Luna. 3 days until she was, for the first time in 40 years, entirely herself. She pressed one hand flat against the old stone wall of the courtyard, felt the cold of it travel up through her palm and into her wrist, and she made herself a quiet promise, not to Thornmere, not to Haldor, not to Evander, or his careful silences or Sarah's cutting smile. A promise to Ashvale, to the countryside, to the house her grandmother had left her and the fields she had not walked since she was a girl. I am coming home, she thought. Whatever that means now. I am coming home. The lavender moved in the wind. The moon pulled in her blood. And somewhere far beneath the stone of the courtyard, so deep she almost didn't feel it, something answered. The road to Ashvale was not a road so much as a suggestion. It curved through the low hills south of Thornmere, like something that had started with good intentions and then simply given up around the second mile. Callis's cart, a modest, slightly lopsided thing she had hired from a stable boy, who clearly felt the transaction was beneath him, rattled over every root and stone with the enthusiasm of something determined to shake her remaining teeth loose. She held the reins with both hands and kept her eyes on the tree line. She had packed light. 2 trunks, 1 satchel, the small embroidered box that had belonged to her mother, and a clay pot containing a cutting of lavender from the courtyard garden. The only thing she had taken without asking. Nobody had stopped her. Nobody had noticed. That, she thought, told her everything she needed to know about the last 40 years. The countryside opened up slowly, the way countryside does, grudgingly at first, then all at once. The dense pine forest thinned, and then the hills softened, and then there were fields on either side, long and golden and slightly wild at the edges, the way fields get when they have not been managed by someone who cares. The afternoon light came in low and warm, and the air smelled of turned earth and something sweet she could not immediately name. Her chest did something complicated. She had not let herself feel anything in the hall. She had not let herself feel anything in the 3 days since, moving through the castle's formal process of removal. The quiet retrieval of her belongings, the polite and meaningless farewells, Evander's brief and carefully worded note that said he wished her well and hoped she would find peace and comfort in her retirement, as though she were a hound being put out to pasture. Retirement. She was 62, not 100. But now, with the cart rattling beneath her and the fields on either side and the old farmhouse coming into view at the bend in the road, her grandmother's house, low and wide and stone-built, with a sagging gate and a very opinionated rooster standing on top of it, she felt the thing she had been holding back shift in her chest, like a river finding a new channel. She pulled the cart to a stop. The house was smaller than she remembered. Or perhaps she was simply larger now, in all the ways that had nothing to do with height. The stone walls were intact, though the mortar needed attention in several places. The shutters on the eastern window had developed a particular angle that suggested they had been arguing with the wall for quite some time and were losing. The garden was, well, the garden was, let us say, expressing itself freely. She was still looking at it, cataloging repairs the way women who have run large households automatically catalog problems, when the gate swung open, or rather, the rooster stepped aside with great reluctance, as though granting a personal audience, and a woman appeared. She was perhaps 65, broad-shouldered, with white hair piled on her head in a construction that defied both gravity and reason. She wore an apron printed with what appeared to be rabbits, though Callis could not be entirely certain, and she was holding a wooden spoon in one hand with the authority of someone who considered it a legitimate weapon. "Well," the woman said, planting both feet and looking Callis up and down with the frank appraisal of someone who had absolutely no intention of being subtle about it. You're taller than I expected. Thinner, too. They didn't feed you up at that castle? Callus blinked. I'm sorry. Do I know you? You don't. I know you, which is better. The woman walked forward and held out the hand that was not occupied with the spoon. Marta Fenwick. I've been minding your grandmother's house since old Betha passed. Lord rest her, because nobody else was going to do it, and I am constitutionally unable to watch a good house go to ruin. You're welcome, by the way. Callus stepped down from the cart, somewhat automatically. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. The east wall needs repointing. There's something living in the cellar that I have chosen not to investigate further, and your well has an attitude. Marta squinted at the clay pot in Callus's arms. Is that lavender? It is. Good. I planted rosemary along the south wall, but I've always felt rosemary has an arrogance to it. Lavender is more honest. She turned and walked back toward the house with the spoon over one shoulder. Come on, then. I made soup. Callus stood for a moment in the lane, the lavender pot in her arms, the lopsided cart behind her, the rooster eyeing her from atop the gatepost with an expression of deep personal skepticism. Somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the exhaustion and the grief and the strange, tentative feeling she was not yet ready to call hope, something that might have been a laugh made a small, surprised sound. She followed Marta inside. The soup was good. Unexpectedly, almost unreasonably good. A thick vegetable broth with herbs she didn't recognize, and a heavy bread that tasted like it had been baked by someone who took the matter seriously. Callus sat at her grandmother's old table, which was exactly where it had always been, and still had the same burn mark near the left corner from an incident her grandmother had never fully explained, and she ate 2 bowls without entirely meaning to. Marta sat across from her and talked. This appeared to be Marta's primary mode of existence. The village is small. You know this. About 40 families now, fewer than when your grandmother was alive. There's a mill, a market on Thursdays, a healer named Bren who knows what she's doing about 2/3 of the time, which is better than average, and a tavern called the Stumbling Hound, which is exactly what it sounds like. She tore a piece of bread. The Fenwick land borders yours on the north side. My son manages most of it now. Good boy. Terrible at conversation, but you can't have everything. And to the south? Callus asked. Marta's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but Callus had spent 40 years reading courts, and she did not miss the slight pause before the answer. The old Caldwell holding belongs to Thomas Caldwell now. He's been there. 12 years? Since his wife passed. She said it matter-of-factly, but her eyes watched Callus just a fraction too carefully. Keeps to himself mostly. Grows things. Fixes things. Has a dog named Bishop who is, and I say this with respect, the ugliest creature I have ever seen, and I once saw a marsh toad in formal clothing. Despite herself, Callus looked up. I'm sorry, a marsh toad in what? Don't ask. Festival of the Harvest Moon 3 years ago. My point is, Bishop the dog makes that toad look elegant. Marta waved her spoon. Thomas is a good man, quiet, helps when help is needed, doesn't offer opinions when they aren't, which is a rarer combination than people realize. Callus looked down at her bowl. I'm not here looking for neighbors, she said, and she meant it, not unkindly, but with the particular firmness of a woman who has had enough of other people's expectations for one lifetime. Nobody ever is, Marta said cheerfully. That's usually when they find the best ones. That night, Callus slept in her grandmother's bedroom, in the old iron frame bed with its patchwork quilt that smelled of cedar and thyme. The moon through the window was 2 nights from full now. She could feel the pull of it more strongly here than she ever had in the castle. Something about the open fields, the absence of stone walls, the way the countryside simply let the moonlight exist without interrupting it. The rite of severance would complete at the full moon. She would feel it, she had been told. A pulling sensation, brief and clean. The bond between Aluna and her king, dissolved by lunar law, After that, she would be unmated, fully free. A status that carried, in the kingdom's social architecture, a complex mixture of pity and suspicion that she had decided, somewhere on the rattling road to Ashvale, to refuse entirely. She lay still and listened to the house settle around her. And then, so subtle she would have missed it if she had not been an Omega, if her senses had not been tuned by a lifetime of noticing what others overlooked. She felt it. Not the pull of the moon. Something else. Something that came from below, from the ground beneath the floorboards and the foundation stones. A low and rhythmic vibration, almost like a pulse. Like something old waking up. She pressed her palm flat against the mattress, then slowly lowered it to the floorboards beside the bed. The wood was smooth and cool, and beneath it, faint and patient as a heartbeat, the pulse continued. Moonroot, she thought, the word arriving without invitation, from some part of her memory she could not immediately locate. Her grandmother had used that word once, long ago, in the voice she reserved for things she considered important enough to say only once. When a woman plants herself in honest ground, the ground remembers. She had not thought about that in 40 years. Now she could not stop. She lay in the dark, her hand against the floor, the moon 2 nights from full, and something beneath the earth of Ashvale held its breath. And waited. The full moon rose on a Thursday. Callus knew because it was market day in the village, and because the pull in her blood had been building since dawn. Not painful exactly, but insistent, like a hand pressed firmly against a door she had already decided to walk through. She had spent the morning doing practical things deliberately. She had repointed a section of the east wall with mortar she mixed herself, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up, because practical work had always been her answer to anything she could not think her way through. She had planted the lavender cutting in the south-facing bed near the kitchen window, pressing it into the soil with both hands, and when the earth closed around the roots, she had felt, again, that low, patient pulse from 2 nights before. She did not mention it to Marta, who arrived at 8:30 with a basket of eggs and a running commentary on the village market that functioned as both news service and mild theater. Old Pren is selling his honey again, the dark kind, which tastes extraordinary, and which he will tell you is made by ordinary bees if you ask him, which nobody does anymore because we have all agreed as a community to simply not ask. Marta set the eggs on the table and began making herself entirely at home in the kitchen, which Callus was beginning to understand was simply Marta's natural state in any building she entered. There's a new fabric stall. The woman running it has opinions about sleeves that I find aggressive, but the linen is good. And Thomas Caldwell was at the mill this morning with a cartload of winter wheat, if you were wondering. I wasn't, Callus said. Of course not. Marta cracked an egg with the efficiency of someone who has had this conversation before, in slightly different forms, many times. He asked about you, though. Callus looked up from the wall section she was examining for further damage. He doesn't know me. He knows you arrived. Villages know things. It's basically their only function. Marta gestured with a broken eggshell. He said, and I am quoting precisely, I hope she settles in well. The south fence between our properties needs attention on her side. I can fix it if she'd like, no obligation. Then he went back to his wheat. That's the longest speech I've heard from the man in 6 months. Callus was quiet for a moment. She had built a life inside a court where nothing was offered without cost, where every gesture carried a ledger behind it. Favor given, favor owed, the endless careful arithmetic of power. A man who offered to fix a fence with no obligation and then went back to his wheat was either very simple or very genuine, and she had learned at some cost to tell the difference. Tell him thank you, she said, and that I'll manage the fence myself. Marta's expression suggested she found this response simultaneously predictable and unwise, but she said nothing further on the subject, which was, Callus was learning, its own kind of commentary. The rite of severance came at moonrise, She had been prepared for it, or had believed she was. She stood in the back garden as the full moon cleared the hill and the light fell across the fields in a long silver wash, and she waited. The pull in her blood reached its peak, held, and then, with a sensation she could only describe as a cord going slack, it released. The bond was gone. She stood in the moonlight and breathed. She had expected grief. She found instead something quieter and more honest. A vast, open stillness, like a field after harvest. Not empty. Cleared. Ready. And then the ground moved. Not violently. Not an earthquake. Nothing that would have rattled the shutters or alarmed the rooster, who was already asleep and opinionated about being woken. It was more like the earth exhaling. A slow, deep shift beneath the soles of her feet, traveling up through the stone path and into her legs and settling in her chest like a second heartbeat. The lavender she had planted that morning was glowing. Faintly. So faintly that in daylight she would have missed it entirely. Each tiny blossom held a thread of silver light, the same color as the moonlight above, but warmer, more internal, as though the light were coming from inside the plant rather than falling upon it. As she watched, that same silver thread traced itself along the soil, following the roots outward, spreading through the bed and then beneath the stone path and continuing, south, toward the Caldwell land. Callus crouched down. She pressed both palms flat against the earth, the way she had against the floorboards 2 nights before, and the pulse she had felt then was no longer subtle. It was clear and rhythmic and unmistakably alive, and it traveled in 2 directions at once, down into the deep earth of Ashvale and outward, following that silver thread south through the soil. When a woman plants herself in honest ground, her grandmother had said, "The ground remembers." She sat back on her heels and looked at the glowing lavender and the silver line moving through the earth, and she thought, with the particular careful rationality of a woman who has seen enough of the world to respect things she does not yet understand, that she needed to find out what her grandmother had actually known about this land. And perhaps at some point she would need to speak to the man on the other side of that fence. But not tonight. Tonight she sat in the moonlight with her palms against the earth and let Ashvale remember her, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could honestly measure, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Behind her, the rooster shifted on his post, opened one eye, regarded the glowing garden with the profound indifference of a creature who has decided that most things are beneath his concern, and went back to sleep. She met Thomas Caldwell 3 days later, entirely by accident, over a broken fence post. Callus had been walking the southern boundary of her property in the early morning, cataloging what needed doing the way she cataloged everything, methodically, without drama, because drama did not repoint walls or rehang gates. The fence between her land and the Caldwell holding was a simple thing, post and rail, old but well-maintained on the south side and somewhat less well-maintained on her side, which was a reasonable reflection of the fact that she had not been here in 40 years. One of the posts on her side had listed to a dramatic angle, as though making a philosophical point about the nature of uprightness. She was studying it, her hands on her hips, calculating whether it needed replacement or simply persuasion, when a voice came from the other side of the fence. "The footing's rotted at the base. It'll need a new post." She looked up. The man standing on the other side was tall. Not imposing tall, but the easy tall of someone who had simply grown that way and never thought much about it. Broad through the shoulders, with large hands that had the particular quality of hands that have spent a lifetime doing useful work. His hair was white, cut short, and his face was the kind of face that takes weather well. Lined, unhurried, with a mouth that seemed inclined toward quiet rather than speech. He was holding a fence post in one hand and a mallet in the other, apparently mid-task on his own section of the boundary, and he was looking at the tilted post on her side with the focused assessment of someone who finds broken things interesting rather than annoying. "I know," Callus said. "I was determining whether to replace or brace it." "Replace," he said without hesitation. Bracing a rotted footing is just postponing the same problem with extra steps. She looked at him for a moment. You're Thomas Caldwell. I am. He did not seem startled that she knew. He simply nodded, as though her knowing was a reasonable outcome of things. And you're Callis, Betha's granddaughter. Yes. She talked about you, he said. He set the mallet down on his fence rail. Not often, but when she did, she meant it. Callis was not prepared for that. She had been prepared for polite introductions, perhaps an offer to help she could gracefully decline, the ordinary social geometry of new neighbors. She had not been prepared for someone to say her grandmother had talked about her with that particular quality in his voice. Not pity, not curiosity, just the simple acknowledgement of a fact he considered worth mentioning. She looked back at the tilted post because it was easier than looking at him. What did she say? That you were stubborn in the useful way, he said, and that the land would know you when you came back to it. He paused. I didn't entirely understand what she meant at the time. The pulse beneath the earth, steady and familiar now, moved through the soles of her feet. And now? She asked, before she could decide not to. He was quiet for a moment, in the easy way of someone who takes questions seriously rather than answering them immediately. Now I think she understood this land better than most people understood anything. He picked up the mallet again. I have an extra post if you need one. Proper timber, seasoned. You're welcome to it. I can source my own timber. You can, he agreed, entirely without offense. The offer stands either way. He went back to his work on his side of the fence. Callis stood on her side and watched him set the post with efficient, unhurried movements. No wasted motion, no performance, just the work being done because it needed doing. There was something almost disorienting about it. She had spent 4 decades in a court where everything was performance, where the simplest gesture carried subtext, and the straightest statement bent under the weight of what it was really meant to accomplish. This man appeared to simply mean what he said. The novelty of it was almost unsettling. She went back to studying her tilted post. They worked in parallel for the better part of an hour, each on their own side of the fence, not speaking much but not avoiding speech either. The occasional practical exchange, a question about the soil in the eastern field, a comment about the weather that was coming in from the north. The morning light moved across the fields in long golden degrees, and the air smelled of turned earth and the faint green sharpness of things beginning to grow. Marta arrived at 11, because Marta arrived at 11 most days now, apparently having decided that Callis's renovation project was a community endeavor. She appeared at the gate with a basket, surveyed the scene at the fence line with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions are being confirmed, and called out at a volume that was entirely unnecessary given that everyone could see her clearly. Thomas Caldwell, are you helping or supervising? Helping, he said, without looking up from his work. Good. There's bread in this basket, and I made 2 loaves because I had a feeling. She set the basket down with the gravity of a woman presenting evidence. Don't let her tell you she's not hungry. She ate half a bowl of porridge this morning and called it sufficient, which it is not. Marta, Callis said. I'm just reporting facts, Marta said serenely. Facts are not interference. Thomas looked up then, briefly, and there was something in his expression, the very edge of something warm and amused, quickly returned to neutral. That Callis noticed the way she noticed small things, without intending to, filing it away without immediately knowing why. They ate the bread at the fence line, standing, because neither of them had suggested sitting, and neither seemed to need to. Marta ate with them and talked enough for 3 people, which was, Callis was realizing, one of her genuine gifts. She filled silence so completely that you could exist inside it without the silence becoming a burden. And her commentary on village life was so specific and affectionate that even the strangest details had the warmth of stories told about people you already loved. When Marta finally departed, with instructions, issued to no one in particular, that the east wall needed attention before the rain came, and that she would be back Thursday with proper soup, the quiet that remained was not awkward. It simply was. Two people at a fence line with bread crusts and the sound of the fields. "She means well," Callis said, because it felt like it needed saying. "I know," Thomas said. "She organized the whole village when my barn roof came down 2 winters ago. Had it rebuilt in a week." He looked out across the fields. "She doesn't stop, but she doesn't need to be thanked, which is rarer than the not stopping." Callis looked at him sideways. "You notice things like that." "I have time to notice," he said simply. "It's a quiet life." She turned that over. Not lonely, not resigned, just quiet, as though quiet were a thing of value rather than a lack. "Was it always?" she asked. She was not sure why she asked it. She blamed the bread, or the morning light, or the pulse beneath the earth that had been steady as a second heartbeat since she planted the lavender. He was quiet for a moment again, in that way of his. "No," he said at last. "Not always." And then, before the silence could become something heavy, "Do you want the post or not? I'll bring it over tomorrow morning if you do." "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He nodded. He picked up his mallet and went back to his land, walking across the field in long, unhurried strides, and the dog, Bishop presumably, and Marta had not been wrong about him. He appeared to be composed of equal parts determination and structural irregularity, bounded after him from wherever he had been investigating. Callis stood at the fence for a moment longer. The silver thread in the soil, faint in the daylight, barely perceptible, but there if she looked, ran straight from the lavender bed behind her to the place where Thomas Caldwell's boots had stood. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up her tools and walked back to the house, and she did not let herself think about what it meant. Not yet. There was a wall to repoint and a garden to clear, and 40 years of a life to quietly set down before she had any business picking up something new. But the earth had other ideas, and somewhere deep beneath the fields of Ashvale, old as the stone and patient as roots, the moonroot bond continued its slow and certain work. Spring came to Ashvale the way it always did in the countryside, not announced, but discovered. One morning the fields were still and pale, and then, without ceremony, they were green. Callis noticed it the way she had been noticing everything since her arrival, with the particular attention of a woman who had spent 40 years indoors in stone halls, where the seasons were mostly an administrative concern. Here, the seasons were personal. The cold came through the window glass and the warmth came up through the garden soil, and the rain arrived with a smell that settled in the back of the throat like something remembered from childhood. She had been in Ashvale 5 weeks. In those 5 weeks, she had repointed the east wall, rehung the eastern shutter, cleared the garden of 3 seasons' worth of enthusiastic overgrowth, and replaced 4 fence posts, the first with Thomas's timber, the subsequent 3 with her own, because she had found the mill and the miller's wife, a woman named Dora, who respected a precise measurement and did not ask unnecessary questions. She had also, without entirely planning to, fallen into a rhythm. Thomas came most mornings to work on the boundary fence. His side perpetually found new things to attend to, which she suspected was not entirely coincidental. And they worked in parallel, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't. And both were easy in a way that still surprised her when she thought about it directly. So she mostly didn't think about it directly. She thought about fence posts and soil pH, and the way the lavender had spread 3 inches south since she planted it. Always south. Always following the invisible line of the moonroot thread. That she thought about more than she thought about Thomas, and she was aware that this distinction was becoming less convincing the longer she maintained it. It was Marta who first said the word out loud. She arrived one Tuesday morning, her off day, which apparently meant she redirected her considerable energy toward Callis's kitchen, and found Callis at the south window, watching Thomas work a section of field with a methodical patience that she told herself she was not watching specifically, You know, Marta said, setting down her basket and following Callus's gaze with absolutely zero pretense of subtlety. In the village, they've started calling you two the fence people, because you're always at the fence. We're neighbors, Callus said. The fence is on the property line. The fence, Marta said, has been technically finished for 2 weeks. Thomas repaired the last post on your side 11 days ago. I counted. She took out a cabbage with the authority of someone presenting a legal argument. He keeps finding new things to do over there. Yesterday I saw him realigning a perfectly straight rail. Callus turned from the window. Marta. I'm just reporting facts, Marta said, for the second time since they'd met, with the same perfect serenity. Facts are not interference. She began chopping the cabbage. He's a good man, Callus. Not a complicated man, a good one. There's a difference. Complicated men explain themselves constantly. Good ones just keep showing up. Callus was quiet for a moment. I'm 62 years old, she said. Not defensively, just as a fact she was placing on the table next to Marta's cabbage. I know how old you are, Marta said. I'm 65. My husband died 8 years ago, and I still occasionally catch myself reaching for his coffee cup in the morning. She did not look up from the chopping. Age is not the point. The point is whether the ground feels right under your feet. The moonroot pulse moved steadily beneath the kitchen floor. Callus said nothing, but she did not move away from the window. It was Thomas himself who brought the complication. 2 days after her conversation with Marta, he came to the fence at the usual hour, but did not pick up his tools. He stood at the rail with his hands in his pockets, which she had learned was his posture for things that required saying rather than doing. I need to tell you something, he said, because someone in the village will tell you eventually, and I'd rather you hear it from me. She set down her trowel. All right. He looked out across the field for a moment. Before your grandmother passed, in the last year of her life, she came to me. She knew something was in this land, something old, connected to the moonlight and the soil, that she said had been dormant since her own mother's time. He paused. She asked me to watch the property, not to guard it. She was very specific that it wasn't about guarding. She said the land would know when the right person came back to it, and when it did, there would be a thread in the soil that led somewhere, and that whoever was at the end of that thread needed to be someone she trusted. Callus was very still. She asked you, she said slowly, to be here. When I came back. She asked me to choose to be here, he said. She said, and again I'm being precise because she was precise, that it had to be a free choice, or it wouldn't count. The land has rules. He looked at her then, directly, with the unhurried honesty she had come to recognize as simply the way he operated. I've been here 12 years. I had my own reasons for coming south after Clara passed. But yes, your grandmother told me what she knew, and I stayed partly because of it. Callus processed this. And the thread in the soil? She asked. Have you seen it? A brief pause. I felt it, he said. The night of the full moon, through the floorboards. He looked faintly uncomfortable, as though admitting this cost him something. I assumed I'd imagined it until the lavender. The lavender glows, she said. Yes, he said. I can see it from my window on clear nights. Another pause. I didn't mention it because I wasn't sure how to mention it without sounding reasonable, she said. You sound entirely reasonable. I have been watching the thread travel south through my garden for 5 weeks. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly, but the particular quality of tension leaving a person who has been carrying something alone and has finally set it down. What does it mean? He asked. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I intend to find out. For the first time since they'd met, he smiled, a real smile, slow and full, the kind that starts in the eyes before it reaches the mouth. It changed his face entirely. Callus noticed this and filed it carefully in the place where she was keeping all the things about Thomas Caldwell that she was not yet ready to examine. "Your grandmother's books might help," he said. "She had a shelf of them in the cellar. I moved them to the shelf in the back room before the damp could reach them, 2 years ago. I should have mentioned that earlier." "You moved my grandmother's books. To protect them?" "Yes." He looked briefly uncertain. "I left them in order." Callus looked at him for a long moment. "Of course you did," she said, and something in her voice made his smile come back, smaller this time, but no less real. She spent that evening in the back room with her grandmother's books. They were old, not ancient, but old enough to smell of another era, their spines cracked and their pages soft with handling. Most were practical: herbalism, soil management, the keeping of bees, a long and highly personal journal about the behavior of the local rooster population, which Callus set aside for later. But at the back of the shelf, behind a row of seed catalogs, she found a thinner volume with no title on the spine. Its cover was plain gray cloth, worn at the corners. Inside, her grandmother's handwriting, slanted, precise, deeply familiar, filled the pages in dark ink. The first entry read, "The moonroot bond is not a legend. I have seen it twice in my life. Once in my mother, once in myself. It asks nothing and offers everything, which is why most people miss it entirely. It does not announce itself. It grows. It activates when a woman of this bloodline plants living roots in Ashvale soil as a free choice. Not obligation, not arrangement, not necessity, but choice. The moon witnesses the planting. The earth maps the connection, and the thread that forms will lead to the one soul in the living world whose frequency matches hers. The bond cannot be forced. It cannot be directed. It can only be followed or ignored. If ignored, it fades in one lunar cycle and does not return. If followed, if both people choose, with full knowledge, to walk toward it, it completes. And what completes does not break." Callus sat with the book in her lap and the lamplight warm around her, and the pulse beneath the floor steady as breathing. The lavender outside was glowing. She turned the page. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, tucked inside a sealed courier envelope, stamped with the silver wolf crest of Thornmere. Callus was in the garden when Marta brought it to her, holding it between 2 fingers with the expression of someone handling something mildly suspicious. "Came with the Morning Post," she said. "Royal seal. Your son's handwriting on the outside." Callus wiped her hands on her work apron and took it. Evander's handwriting had always been beautiful, precise, vertical, the handwriting of someone who had been trained to present well. She had taught him to write at this very table, 40 years ago, on visits to Ashvale before the court had swallowed all the time she had once called her own. She remembered his small hands around the pen, the fierce concentration on his child's face, the way he had looked up at her when he got a letter right. She opened the envelope. The letter was brief. Evander had always been brief. It was his version of efficiency, though she had long suspected it was also his version of avoiding. "Mother, I write to inform you that father intends to formalize his bonding to Lady Vessa of the Hartwell line at the next court gathering, 6 weeks hence. As this will be presented as a matter of alliance and succession, your presence will not be required or expected. I thought it appropriate that you hear this from me rather than through rumor. I hope Ashvale is comfortable. D." She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the garden wall. The bonding to Lady Vessa, of course. Vessa of Hartwell, who was 41 and of pure noble wolf blood, whose lineage traced back 6 generations of alpha kings, who had been at court for 3 years with the particular patience of someone who knows they are waiting for something to become available. Callus had watched it from across the great hall for 2 of those 3 years and had said nothing, because saying something would have required acknowledging what she already knew. She was not angry. She examined herself carefully for anger and found instead something more complicated. A grief that was not for Haldor specifically, but for the version of her own life that had been spent in service of something that had never considered her indispensable. 40 years. She had been competent, careful, loyal, and fair. She had run his household with precision and managed his court relationships with a diplomatic skill that had kept more than one alliance intact. None of that had been sufficient. None of that had been the point. The point had always been bloodline. The point had always been what she could not provide. She stood in the garden and breathed and let the grief be what it was. Not a crisis, but a closing. The last door of a house she had already left. Thomas found her there an hour later. He had come to return a pruning tool she had lent him the previous week, and he came through the gate the way he always did, announcing himself clearly, no presumption of welcome, the tool held out like an offering. He stopped when he saw her face. He did not ask what was wrong. He set the tool down on the wall beside the folded letter and stood near her with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the garden the way he looked at things that needed time rather than words. After a while, she told him, not everything, not the long, complicated interior history of 40 years, but the shape of it, the letter, the bonding announcement, the particular exhaustion of being replaced by something you always knew was coming. He listened the way he did everything, with complete attention and no apparent need to fix it. When she finished, he said, "Do you want to walk? The north field is clear this morning, and the ground is good after the rain." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." They walked for nearly 2 hours, through the north field and along the old stone wall that divided Ashvale from the common land, and the conversation moved the way conversations do when two people are walking. Easier than it would have been sitting still, carried forward by motion, finding its own level. He told her about Clara, his wife, gone 12 years, a woman who had apparently been formidably practical and deeply kind, and had grown the best kitchen garden in 3 counties. He told it without performance, without the careful packaging of grief she was used to seeing in court. Just the facts of a person he had loved and missed, and continued to carry with him in the way you carry people when the carrying has become part of who you are. She told him about her early years at Thornmere, not the failures, but the before, the girl from Ashvale who had arrived at a great stone castle with good instincts and no blueprint, and had simply begun building a life from what was available. The small victories she had never been allowed to claim publicly, the people she had helped quietly, in the margins of official history. He listened to all of it. The afternoon light came in low and golden across the field, and the air was warm and smelled of new grass, and somewhere behind it, very faintly, the lavender, which made no geographic sense since the lavender bed was behind the house and they were half a mile north, but which she had stopped questioning on the grounds that Ashvale apparently operated by its own logic. "The book says the bond has to be followed," she said eventually, because it was the thing she had been carrying since finding it, and she had decided at some point during the walk that not saying it was its own kind of dishonesty. Both people, freely. Or it fades. He walked 2 more steps before answering. "I know," he said. "Your grandmother told me what to read if I ever felt the pulse in the ground." A pause. "I read it the morning after the full moon." She stopped walking. He stopped too, a step ahead, and turned back to her. The late light was behind him, and his face was in shadow, but she could see his expression clearly enough, the same unhurried honesty, but with something underneath it now, something that had been waiting for the right moment, the way roots wait for rain. "I'm not asking anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not the bond asking through me, or your grandmother's wish asking through me, or this land asking through me. I'm asking as Thomas, who is standing in a field with a woman he's spent 5 weeks talking to at a fence and finds himself," he paused, chose the word carefully, "grateful for every morning of it." The pulse in the earth was very present. Callus looked at him for a long moment. She thought of the letter on the garden wall. She thought of 40 years and the word retirement and Evander's vertical handwriting. She thought of her grandmother's voice. The bond cannot be forced. It can only be followed or ignored. "I'm not ready," she said. Honestly, fully. "I don't know what I am yet, on the other side of all of that. I need to know who I am here before I can know what I want." "That's fair," he said, without flinching, without recalibrating, without the subtle withdrawal she had learned to expect from men when told not yet. Just, "That's fair," as though her need to know herself were a reasonable and respectable thing. She exhaled. "But I'm grateful too," she said. "For the fence mornings." He nodded. His mouth made that small, real smile. "Good," he said. "There's still a section of rail on the northwest corner that needs looking at." She laughed. It came out surprised, like something she had forgotten she knew how to do. A real laugh, full and unguarded, rising up into the open afternoon air of the north field. He looked momentarily startled by it, and then pleased, in the private way of someone who has just witnessed something they will remember. They walked back through the field as the light went golden to amber, and the earth pulsed beneath their feet in the same easy rhythm, and somewhere behind the house the lavender held its silver glow, and the thread in the soil waited with the patience of something that has always known it has time. But back at Thornmere, in a high stone room where a man who was not cruel sat with a document and a growing unease he could not entirely name, something else was beginning. Haldor had felt it. 3 days ago, faintly, then 2 days ago, stronger. A resonance in the old pack bonds, a tremor in the lunar law he had administered for 40 years, coming from the south, from the countryside, from a land that had no business affecting Thornmere's bonds. He set down the document. He called for his advisor. And the thing that had begun quietly in a lavender bed began, without announcing itself, to reach toward a complication. Haldor arrived on a Friday morning without announcement, with 2 advisors and a horse that was too fine for a countryside road. Callus was at the well when she heard the hooves on the lane. She did not turn immediately. She finished drawing the water, set the bucket down with care, and then turned, because she had learned, over decades of court life, that the person who turns last holds more ground. He looked older than she remembered, which was unreasonable given that she had last seen him 6 weeks ago. But perhaps what she was seeing was not age so much as the particular quality that settles onto powerful men when something has unsettled them. A tightness around the jaw, a wariness in the eyes that did not belong to a man accustomed to being wary. He dismounted at the gate without waiting for invitation. "Callus," he said. "Haldor," she said. Just that. She did not add his title. She was not his Luna anymore, and this was not his land, and she was 62 years old and had nothing left to perform. He stepped through the gate. His advisors remained outside it, which told her this was not an official visit, or was meant to appear as something other than one. He looked at the house, at the cleared garden, at the lavender bed along the south wall that was, in the full morning light, faintly luminous in a way that had nothing to do with the angle of the sun. He looked at it for a long time. "You've felt it," she said. Not a question. 3 days ago. His voice was measured. It was always measured. A resonance in the pack bonds, something old, operating in lunar law, originating from this land. He looked at her then. "I need to understand what it is." "You're welcome to read the document you signed 6 weeks ago," she said. "The one that made this land mine and my affairs my own." A muscle moved in his jaw. "This isn't about the divorce." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But the answer to your question is the same either way. What happens on this land is no longer your concern." He was quiet for a moment. And here was the thing she had always found most difficult about Haldor, The thing that made him genuinely complex rather than simply villainous. He was capable of hearing things he did not want to hear. Not always, not consistently, but sometimes, in the right moment, he actually listened. "There is a law," he said slowly, "older than Thornmere, older than the kingdom, a lunar law that predates the pack bonds by centuries. If a moonroot bond completes on ancestral territory, it supersedes all previous pack claims." He paused. "Including royal succession claims." Callus was very still. "If your bond completes," he continued, "the land of Ashvale and everything tied to it passes outside of Thornmere's legal reach, permanently. Whatever children—" He stopped. The word landed between them with the particular weight of 40 years of history. Whatever heirs are connected to this land cannot be claimed by the crown. She understood then, not the surface of it, that she had grasped immediately, but the deep structure of his concern. This was not about her. It was not even entirely about the land. It was about the dynasty he had spent his life building, and the cracks he could feel forming in its foundation, and about the terrifying possibility that the woman he had dismissed as insufficient might, by simply coming home and planting lavender, unravel a legal architecture he had taken for granted. "You should have considered the ancient laws before you signed the settlement," she said. "I didn't know the bond could activate," he said. And there it was, the thing she had not expected. Not defiance, not threat. Something that sounded with an honesty that cost him, like admission. "Your grandmother never—" "The land had been dormant for 40 years. I assumed—" "You assumed it was irrelevant," she said. "Because I was irrelevant." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard in a quiet garden. He did not deny it. That, perhaps, was the most honest thing he had done in 40 years of marriage. "I need you to stop it," he said finally. "Or delay it. Until after Vessa's bonding is formalized and the succession is legally secured. After that, I have no claim here, and I won't pursue one." "You're asking me," she said carefully, "to set aside something that has been growing in this land since before either of us was born, that belongs to me, that harms no one, in order to make your new life more convenient." "I'm asking you," he said, and his voice was quieter now, with something in it she had not heard often, something that was not quite regret, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Because I am aware that I have very little right to ask you anything. And I am asking anyway, because I don't have another option, and because you are the only person in my life who has ever been genuinely honest with me." She looked at him. That last sentence was, she thought, probably the truest thing he had ever said to her. And it was, simultaneously, the saddest thing she had ever heard. That after 40 years, the only honest relationship he could identify was the one he had discarded. "I'll think about it," she said. It was not a yes. He knew it was not a yes. But he nodded, because it was more than he had expected, and he walked back through the gate, and his horse's hooves faded on the lane, and Callus stood in the garden with her hands at her sides, and the lavender glowing beside her, and the pulse beneath the earth holding perfectly, patiently steady. Marta arrived 20 minutes later, because Marta had apparently watched the entire encounter from behind her own gate, which she defended later as being in the lane for a completely separate reason. "That was the king," she said, with the tone of someone confirming a very interesting fact. "It was," Callus said. "He looked uncomfortable." "He was." Marta studied her. "Are you all right?" Callus considered the question with genuine attention. "Yes," she said. Yes, I am." She paused. "I need to talk to Thomas." Marta's expression did several things in rapid succession, all of them carefully suppressed. "I'll make tea," she said. "Marta." "Tea," Marta said firmly, "is not interference. Tea is infrastructure." Thomas listened to all of it at the fence, the way he listened to everything, completely, without interruption. without the flinching or the recalibrating or the subtle reorientation toward his own concerns that she had come to expect from people when the subject became difficult. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Not what should be done, not what was logical or strategic or legally optimal. What did she want? She had been asked that question so rarely in her life that it still landed with a slight shock, like cold water. "I want to know what completing the bond actually means," she said. "Not the legal implications. What it means for us, for you." She held his gaze. "I'm not willing to make a choice of this size for reasons that aren't real ones." "That's fair," he said, again without flinching. "The book says it requires a conscious choice from both people. A declaration at the new moon with living roots between them." She paused. "That's 12 days away." "I know," he said. "You've already read that part." "I've read all of it," he said simply. "I wanted to understand what I was—" He stopped, chose again. "What was possible? Before I said anything to you that I couldn't take back." The pulse in the earth moved between them, warm and steady. She looked at him, at his honest face and his unhurried eyes and the large weathered hands that fixed things because they needed fixing, and offered posts without obligation, and had apparently spent 12 years in a field because a woman's grandmother had asked him to, and he had considered that a reasonable and worthy thing to do. "Thomas?" she said. "Yes. I'm still not ready to decide, but I want you to know—" She stopped, started again. "I want you to know that when I do decide, it will be for real reasons. Not the bond, not the law, not Haldor or Evander or anything from before." "I know," he said. And then, with the small, real smile, "Bishop found something in your south field this morning. I think it might be the thing Marta's been refusing to investigate in your cellar. It appears to have moved." She stared at him. "What?" "I'm handling it," he said entirely calmly. "What is it?" "I'd rather not say until I'm certain, but it's not dangerous." A pause. "Probably." She opened her mouth, closed it, and then, despite everything, despite Haldor and the bond and the 12 days and the weight of all of it, she laughed again. That same surprised, unguarded laugh. It went up into the spring air and scattered like birds. Thomas watched it happen with the expression of a man who has found something he intends to treasure. The ground pulsed beneath them, warm as sunlight, patient as stone. But that night, in Thornmere, Sarah, Evander's wife, with her cutting smile and her careful ambitions, sent a letter of her own, not to Callus, to the Council of Lunar Elders. And the letter contained a claim that was not entirely true, worded with the precise artistry of someone who understood how to make a lie stand up straight in formal language. It claimed that the moonroot bond was being activated under duress, that Callus was not acting freely, that the bond therefore was invalid. And the council, which had not been called upon in 60 years and was deeply interested in being relevant again, agreed to send an investigator. The investigator's name was Elder Cass, and she arrived on horseback on a gray Tuesday morning, alone, which surprised everyone. Callus had expected formality. A procession, perhaps, or at minimum 2 horses and a sense of occasion. What arrived instead was a woman of perhaps 75, small and upright, with white hair braided tightly back and eyes the color of river stone that assessed everything they landed on, with the quiet precision of someone who has been lied to by experts and has stopped finding it interesting. She dismounted at the gate, tied her horse to the post herself, and looked at the lavender bed for a long moment before she looked at Callus. "The bond is active," she said, by way of greeting. "I could feel it from the North Road. It's been a while since I've been near one." "You've seen it before?" Callus asked. "Once. Long time ago." She came through the gate. "I'm not here to invalidate it, if that's what you're wondering. I'm here because the council was petitioned and is obligated to respond." She glanced around the garden, at the house, at the south fence line where, because of course, Thomas was visible in the distance, working on something that absolutely required his presence there that specific morning. "Is there tea? I've been riding since before dawn and I am not as young as I used to be," which I say as someone who remembers being young and considers it somewhat overrated. Marta, who had appeared in the doorway at the word tea with the speed of someone who had been waiting for exactly this cue, made a sound of profound professional satisfaction and disappeared back into the kitchen. They sat at the garden table, Callis, Elder Cass, and Marta, who had decided that leaving would be the same as missing the best part of a story she had been following for weeks and could not bring herself to do it. Elder Cass set the council's petition document on the table. Callis read it. She read it twice, carefully, the way she read everything. And then she set it down with the same controlled stillness she had used in the Great Hall of Thornmere, because some muscles once built do not forget their purpose. "It says I'm acting under duress," she said. "It says someone claims you're acting under duress," Elder Cass said, with the precision of someone who considers the difference important. The claim was made by a third party with documented interest in the bond's outcome, which the council noted, which is also why they sent me alone instead of a full tribunal. She sipped her tea. "The question I'm required to answer is simple. Is this woman's choice free?" She was looking directly at Callis when she said it. "I haven't made a choice yet," Callis said. "The new moon is in 8 days." "I know." Elder Cass set her cup down. "That's why I'm here now, and not after. A choice made under investigation pressure isn't free either." She folded her hands on the table. "So I'm going to ask you one question, and I want your honest answer, and then I'm going to go away and write my report and leave you to your 8 days." Callis waited. "Is there anything or anyone on this land," Elder Cass said, "that is making you feel that you must follow the bond rather than choose to?" The garden was very quiet. The lavender moved in a small breeze. Somewhere south, across the fence, Bishop barked once at something and was quiet again. Callis thought about Haldor's request. She thought about Evander's letter. She thought about Sarah's calculated smile and the petition on the table and 40 years of being assessed for what she could or could not provide. Then she thought about Thomas at the fence, about the post offered with no obligation, about "that's fair," said without flinching, every time, about a man who had read her grandmother's book and waited 12 years and had still not said a single word to her that carried the weight of expectation. "No," she said. "Nothing and no one." Elder Cass studied her for a moment longer. Then she nodded, once definitively, with the manner of someone closing a file. "Good," she said. She picked up the petition and folded it precisely in half. "For what it's worth, I've investigated 4 bond claims in my career. 2 were genuine manipulations. 1 was a misunderstanding, and 1—" She paused briefly, with something that moved across her face like a cloud's shadow, quick and private. "1 was the truest thing I ever had the privilege of witnessing." She tucked the folded petition inside her coat. "I'll tell the council the claim has no basis." Marta, who had been silent for a record-breaking 12 minutes, made a sound that was technically a clearing of the throat, but was functionally a quiet cheer. Callis found Thomas in his barn that afternoon, mending a piece of harness with the methodical patience of someone who finds repetitive useful work a reasonable way to manage an uncertain morning. He looked up when she came in. He read her face. He had become, without her noticing the exact moment it had happened, very good at reading her face. And the careful tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "She's gone?" he asked. "She's gone. In our favor." Callis stood in the barn doorway with the afternoon light behind her, and she looked at him, at the harness in his hands, and the hay smell of the barn, and the dog asleep in the corner in a position that defied skeletal logic, and she felt the 8 days like a held breath. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." I want to tell you something, not a decision. I meant what I said about needing to know myself first, but something true. He set the harness down. He gave her his full attention, the way he always did, without reservation. Before I came here, she said, I thought what I had lost was the title and the house and the position. That was what everyone assumed I was grieving, even me for a while. She paused. But what I had actually lost, what I had actually never had, was someone who asked what I wanted, who waited for a real answer, who said that's fair and meant it. He was very still. I'm not ready to stand at the bond with you in 8 days, she said, but I want you to know why. It's not because I doubt you. It's because after 40 years of not being certain of myself, I need to be certain now. For the first time, before I choose anything. The afternoon light moved slowly through the barn. Bishop made a sound in his sleep, something between a sigh and a comment. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, Then take the 8 days. Take 20 if you need them. I've been in this field for 12 years. I can wait 8 days. Her throat did something complicated. The bond only gives 8, she said. Then we'll use them well, he said. We don't have to spend them deciding. We can spend them just being here, if that's enough for now. It was, she thought, exactly the right thing to say. It was also, she was becoming increasingly aware, entirely characteristic of him, and that awareness was doing something to the walls she had built across the last 40 years that no amount of deliberate distance was going to stop. I should go, she said. Marta is making something elaborate for dinner, and if I'm not back, she'll reorganize my kitchen. She already reorganized it, he said. 2 weeks ago. The cups are now by the window. Callis stared. How do you know where my cups are? She told me, he said, with perfect calm. She tells me most things. I think she considers me a co-investor in the general project. The project, Callis said slowly, of my life. The project, he agreed, of your life. She looked at him, and there it was, the thing she had been not looking at for weeks, fully visible now in the amber light of his barn with the harness on the floor and the dog asleep and the 8 days like a tide coming in. The warmth of him, the steadiness, the way he made space for her without filling it. She turned before she could stay any longer. She walked back through the field as the light went low, and the pulse in the earth moved with her steps, and behind her, in the barn, a man sat back down with a piece of harness and was, for the first time in 12 years, entirely unable to concentrate on it. The new moon was in 8 days, and somewhere north, in Thornmere, Sarah was reading Elder Cass's report with a smile that had gone very sharp and very still, and reaching for a different kind of letter entirely. Sarah's second letter did not go to the council. It went to Evander. Callis found out on the 6th day before the new moon, when her son arrived at the gate of Ashvale on foot, without advisors, without ceremony, without the horse, and stood in the lane with his hands at his sides and the particular look on his face that she had not seen since he was 11 years old and had broken something valuable and did not know how to say so. She opened the gate herself. He came in. He looked at the house, at the garden, at the lavender glowing softly in the morning light with that warm silver thread tracing south through the soil. He looked at it for a long time, and whatever he had prepared to say appeared to require reorganizing. Sarah sent the second petition, he said finally, not to the council, to the Lunar Tribunal directly. She claimed you are using the bond to make a land claim against the Crown, that completing it is an act of deliberate legal aggression against Thornmere's succession rights. Callis was quiet. The tribunal has the authority to freeze a bond in progress, he continued, to prevent its completion until a full hearing can be convened. He paused. The hearing would take 4 to 6 months. 4 to 6 months. The bond faded in one lunar cycle if not followed. She had known this from the first page of her grandmother's book. Sarah knew it too. This was not a legal challenge. It was a clock, set deliberately to run out before she could act. It was elegant, in the cold way that Sarah's thinking was always elegant, and Callis stood in her garden and felt the specific exhaustion of being opposed by someone who was not fighting her directly, but simply removing her options one by one. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Evander looked at his hands. He had his father's jaw and his father's certainty, and for the first time, she saw something in his face that was neither. Something younger, less rehearsed, something she recognized with a start, as the boy who had looked up at her over his letters with fierce concentration. "Because Sarah filed it without telling me," he said. "I found out this morning." He met her eyes. I'm not." He stopped, started again with what appeared to be genuine effort. "I don't think what was done to you was right. I have thought so for several years and said nothing, and I have been trying to find a reason to justify the saying nothing, and I can't find one anymore." It was not an apology. It was too incomplete to be an apology, and she suspected he knew that. But it was something. The first stone moved from a wall she had thought immovable. "What can be done about the petition?" she asked. "Father can withdraw it on Thornmere's behalf," Evander said. "Sarah filed in the Crown's name without authorization. If he formally disavows it, the tribunal has no standing." A pause. "He'll do it. I'm going back to ask him. Today." She looked at her son, this careful, armored man who had learned to love at a court distance and was standing in her garden without his armor. And she felt the complicated grief of a mother who loves a child who has disappointed her and loves him anyway, which is one of the oldest and most unremarkable griefs in the world, and no less real for that. "Go then," she said. "And Evander." He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for coming here yourself." He nodded. He could not quite hold her gaze. He went back through the gate and down the lane, and she watched until he was around the bend, and then she turned back to her garden and sat down on the stone wall and pressed both palms flat against it and breathed. The pulse in the earth was steady, present, waiting. Thomas found her there an hour later because he had seen Evander arrive from the field and had given her the time, and then could not, in good conscience, give her more of it without knowing she was all right. She told him everything. He listened. When she finished, he sat beside her on the wall, close enough that his arm was warm against hers, not touching, not quite, the way he always calibrated proximity with a care that she had stopped finding foreign and started finding like water. "Even if Evander gets the petition withdrawn," she said, "we have 2 days. And I told you I needed to be certain." "Are you?" he asked. She looked at the lavender, at the silver thread, faint in the daylight, leading south through the soil to the man sitting beside her. At the house her grandmother had left her, rebuilt and clean and smelling of cedar and rosemary, and the bread Marta had brought that morning. At her own hands, on the stone wall. Older hands than they had been in Thornmere, somehow. More honest. "I have spent 40 years, she said slowly, being certain of everything except myself, certain of the protocol, the hierarchy, the correct response in any given situation, and completely, entirely uncertain of whether any of it had anything to do with who I actually was." She paused. "I came here to find out, and I have found out." "What did you find?" he asked very quietly. "That I am someone who gets up in the morning and fixes things because fixing things matters, who plants lavender because it's honest, who laughs at a market day story about a rooster with opinions. A beat. Who has been standing at a fence line every morning for 7 weeks, not because the fence needs attending, but because the person on the other side of it is—" She stopped, chose carefully the way he chose. is the first person in my life who has ever made me feel that being entirely myself is sufficient. More than sufficient. The afternoon was very still. Callus, he said, and the way he said her name, simply, fully, without qualification, was its own kind of declaration. I know, she said. 2 days. 2 days, he agreed. And then his hand, large and weathered and unhurried, moved to cover hers on the stone wall. She turned her hand over and held it. The pulse in the earth rose, warm and certain, and the lavender thread burned silver in the soil, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and it was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was the kind of quiet that only exists between people who have decided, without ceremony, to belong to each other. Haldor's formal disavowal of Sarah's petition reached the lunar tribunal the following morning. It was brief and unambiguous, written in his own hand, carrying the full seal of Thornmere. At the bottom, in the margin, in handwriting that was slightly less controlled than the rest, the handwriting of a man writing something he had not planned to write and wrote anyway, was a single additional line. The land of Ashvale belongs to Callus by right of blood and by right of character. Thornmere makes no claim upon it or upon her. Let the record state that whatever grows there, grows freely. Callus read it the evening before the new moon. She read the margin note twice. She set it down. She did not cry. She sat with it for a moment, the weight of it, the complexity of it, the strange mercy of receiving at the end of 40 years the acknowledgement she had stopped expecting. And then she folded it carefully and placed it in the embroidered box with her mother's things, where it could be what it was. Not a resolution, not an erasure, but a truth, said late. Better late than never. Not the same as on time. Both things true at once. She went to find Thomas. The new moon rose without light, which is what new moons do, dark and potent and full of what is not yet visible. Callus and Thomas stood in the lavender bed at the south edge of her garden, bare feet on the turned earth, the pulse of the bond alive and present beneath them like a third heartbeat shared between the soil and the sky. Marta was inside. She had offered with complete sincerity and only partial success at disguising her curiosity, to witness. Callus had said no. Thomas had said no. Marta had said fine, I'll make something complicated for breakfast tomorrow, and had gone indoors with dignity. Her grandmother's book lay open on the garden wall, the page held flat by 2 smooth stones. The declaration was simple, 7 words in the old tongue, spoken by each of them in turn, with one hand holding a living root between them. The lavender, pulled from the earth and held between their joined hands, its roots cool and damp and real. Do you understand what you're choosing? Callus asked, and it was not a formula from the book, but her own question, the one she needed answered in his voice. I'm choosing you, Thomas said. Callus, not the bond, not the land, not anything your grandmother planned or the moon decreed. You, the woman who told me she wasn't ready and meant it and said so anyway. The woman who laughs like she's surprised by it every time. He looked at her in the dark. I've known since the 3rd morning at the fence. I've been waiting for you to know too. Her chest was full of something that had no precise name. Not happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple, too thin. This was more like the feeling of a door opening into a room that had always been there, that you had always belonged in, that you are finally standing inside of with your shoes on the right floor. I'm choosing you, she said. Thomas. Not because the ground said so. Because you are the first person who ever asked what I wanted and waited for the real answer. The lavender root lay between their joined hands. They spoke the 7 words together, and the earth answered. Not dramatically, not with light or sound or the shaking of anything. Just a warmth that rose through the soles of their feet and traveled upward, slow and thorough, the way warmth travels through stone that has held the sun all day. The silver thread in the soil brightened briefly, a single clean pulse, and then settled. Quiet. Complete. Done. Callus breathed. The lavender between their hands began, very slowly, to regrow its roots downward, reaching toward the earth, finding the soil, planting itself between their palms as though this had always been its purpose. Thomas looked down at it. He made a sound she had never heard from him before, surprised, soft, the sound of a man who has seen something he considers a gift. She looked up at him in the dark, and he looked down at her, and the new moon held its breath above the fields of Ashvale, and what had been begun was finished. And then, from inside the house, Marta's voice carried through the kitchen window with impressive clarity. "I'm not listening. I'm making tea." And Callus laughed, surprised, unguarded, full. And Thomas laughed too, and it rose up into the dark sky above the garden and scattered, and the fields around them were still and warm and very, very alive. 1 year later, Ashvale smelled of bread and turned earth, and, faintly, of the lavender that had spread from its original bed along the south wall to cover nearly the entire garden border, which Marta claimed was excessive and beautiful in the same breath, and tended with the fierce devotion of someone who has unofficially adopted a plant. Callus stood at the kitchen window in the early morning, the way she did most mornings now, her hands around a cup, the light coming in gold and low across the fields, Bishop asleep on the stone step outside with the architectural improbability that was simply his natural state. Thomas was in the east field, visible as a tall shape moving in the morning mist, doing whatever Thomas did in the east field on mornings when the light came in at that angle, and the world was quiet enough to think. She watched him for a moment. There was a version of this year she had not allowed herself to imagine, back in the stone corridor of Thornmere, back when the settlement was being read aloud in dry, formal language, and she had stood with her spine straight and her hands folded and nothing left to perform. She had not allowed herself to imagine it because she had not believed it was a real possibility for someone like her. 62. Omega. No title, no lineage, no particular credential except 4 decades of competence that nobody had put in a document. She had not imagined this kitchen, this window, this light. The cup was warm between her palms. Behind her, the house was alive in the way houses get when they are truly inhabited. Not the formal aliveness of a well-staffed castle, where everything is in its place because someone has been paid to put it there, but the organic aliveness of a place where 2 people have simply lived in it together for a year and let it become itself. Thomas's tools on the hook by the back door. Her grandmother's books on the shelf, joined now by 2 volumes she had written herself. Careful notes on the moonroot bond, on the land's history, on what she had learned in the first year of following something true. The cups by the window, still where Marta had put them, because it turned out she had been right about the light. There were things that had not resolved cleanly. She did not pretend otherwise, not even to herself. Evander had come to Ashvale twice in the past year. Both visits had been brief, careful, conducted with the particular difficulty of a relationship finding a new shape after the old one has broken. There was no pretending the years had not happened. The managed distance, the mild embarrassment, the long silence when she had needed him to speak. There was no undoing that. But there was, perhaps, the beginning of something smaller and more honest. A son who came in person rather than sending letters, who sat at her table and ate Marta's bread and asked, once, with evident effort, whether she was happy. She had told him yes, she had meant it. He had nodded and looked at Thomas across the table and said, "Good." Just that. But he had meant that too. Sarah had not come to Ashvale. Callus did not expect her to. The petition had been formally struck from the tribunal's record, its false claims noted, Sarah's name attached to them in the permanent ledger. That was consequence enough. Callus did not wish her harm. She simply had no use for her, which was a different and more permanent verdict than anger. Haldor had sent 1 letter, 2 months after the bond completed. A formal letter, not personal, acknowledging the permanent independence of the Ashvale territory under lunar law, confirming Thornmere's withdrawal of all claims, signed with his full title. But at the bottom, again in that slightly different handwriting, the handwriting that did not entirely behave, "I hope the lavender is growing well." She had written back 3 words, "Better than expected." She thought that was sufficient for what they had been to each other and what they were now. Not enemies, not friends. 2 people who had shared 40 years and emerged from them with a complex and honest accounting, and who were now living in separate territories with separate lives, which was, all things considered, exactly right. The bond itself had settled into her life the way the best things do. Not as a transformation, but as a clarification. She was not a different person than she had been at the well when Haldor arrived. She was not a different person than the woman who had signed her name on the settlement document and walked through the courtyard with her hand on the stone wall. She was, if anything, more herself. The version of herself that had always been there, waiting under 40 years of performed certainty, finally standing in the right soil. She had asked Thomas once in the winter what it felt like for him. The bond, after completion. He had thought about it for a while, the way he thought about things that deserved more than a quick answer. "Like having a window in a room I didn't know was dark," he said. Not that the room was bad, it was good. Clara was good, and what we had was real. But a window. Light coming in from a direction I hadn't expected. She had understood exactly what he meant. The moonroot bond, her grandmother's book explained in the later pages she had read more carefully now, did not replace what had come before. It did not erase grief or revise history, or insist that everything previous had been insufficient. It simply found the frequency, the particular living pitch of a person's truest self, and matched it to another, not as a command, as an offering. You could ignore it. Plenty had. But if you followed it, with clear eyes and a free choice, it became the most unshakable thing you had ever built. She had found that to be accurate. Marta came through the back door at 8:30, as she did most Tuesdays, with a basket and a running account of the village market that had not yet happened, but which she was pre-reviewing based on what she expected to find there. "The honey will be good this week," she announced, setting the basket down. "Old Pren's bees have been in the South Meadow, which produces a lighter variety with a floral note that pairs extremely well with the cheese from Dora's cousin, who has started a small operation near the mill and whose product I consider promising." She looked at Callis. "You're in the window again." "I'm drinking tea," Callis said. "You're watching Thomas in the field." "Those are not mutually exclusive." "No," Marta agreed, pouring herself tea with the ease of someone entirely at home. "They are not." She stood beside Callis at the window for a moment, looking out at the field and the mist and the tall shape moving through it, and her voice, when she spoke again, was quieter than her usual register. The voice she used for things she meant entirely. "You look different than when you arrived." "It's been a year," Callis said. "Not time," Marta said. "Just different. Like something settled." She sipped her tea. "Your grandmother would have been pleased." Callis looked out at the field. Her grandmother had left her this land, had arranged, in her quiet and particular way, for a good man to be near it when she came back. Had left her a book with 7 words in the old tongue and a pulse in the earth that waited, patient as stone, for the right moment. Had believed, without being there to see it, that her granddaughter would come home. Had believed, perhaps more firmly than Callis herself had ever managed, that Callis was worth coming home to. She pressed one hand flat against the window frame. The wood was warm from the morning light. "I planted myself in honest ground," she thought. And the ground remembered. Outside, Thomas had turned and was walking back toward the house across the field, the mist breaking around him, Bishop bolting ahead with the directional commitment of a creature who has decided that breakfast requires urgency. The east light caught the white of his hair and turned it gold for a moment, and Callus watched it happen with the uncomplicated pleasure of someone who has learned, finally, to receive good things without waiting for the condition attached. He came through the gate. He saw her at the window. He raised one hand, not a wave exactly, just an acknowledgement, the gesture of someone greeting a person they are glad to return to. She raised hers back. Marta made a sound that was technically a clearing of the throat, but was functionally a quiet celebration, and turned to the basket with great professional efficiency. "Eggs," she announced. "And I'm making that thing with the herbs that you said was too much but ate 3 servings of." "It was not 3 servings," Callus said. "It was 3 servings," Thomas said, coming through the back door and stamping mud from his boots with the ease of a man who has been stamping mud from his boots in this kitchen for a year and considers it his permanent right. Callus looked from one of them to the other. 2.5, she said. "At most." They both looked at her with the identical expression of people who have discussed this exact number in her absence and reached a different conclusion, and she laughed. That surprised, unguarded laugh that had begun in a north field one afternoon and had been occurring regularly ever since, like lavender. Like something that, once planted in the right soil, simply keeps growing. The lavender spread a little further south that spring, past the fence line, crossing onto the Caldwell land in a long, unhurried arc. Thomas noticed it first. He came to the fence, still their place, always their place, and looked at it with the expression of someone considering a philosophical development. "Your lavender," he said, "has moved onto my property." "Technically," Callus said, "it's our property now, in any sense that matters." He looked at her. She looked at him. "The deed hasn't changed," he said, and his voice was careful and his eyes were not careful at all. "Then perhaps," she said equally carefully, "it should." The morning was very still. The lavender moved in the light breeze, silver thread visible even in daylight now, fully established, permanent. Bishop was eating something near the gate that did not bear examination. Marta was, undoubtedly, at her own gate, watching with a cup of tea and an expression of complete vindication. Thomas stepped through the fence line and onto the Ashvale side. He stood in front of her, close, the way he had learned she didn't mind, the warmth of him familiar now as morning, and took both her hands in his. "Then ask me properly," he said. She looked up at him, this man who had fixed her fence and offered timber with no obligation, and said that's fair without flinching, and waited 12 years in a field because a woman's grandmother had believed in something, and he had considered that a worthy reason to stay. This honest, unhurried, deeply good man who had made a window in a dark room and called it light. "Thomas Caldwell," she said, with all the certainty she had spent a year building, "will you make this land yours in every way that counts? Will you stay? Not because the ground says so, and not because you have been here before, but because I am asking, and I mean it. And I will mean it every morning for as long as the lavender grows." "Yes," he said, without hesitation, without recalibration, without condition. And then he kissed her, gently, fully, in the morning light at the fence line between their joined properties, with the lavender around their feet and the earth warm beneath them, and the bond settled and complete and quiet as a hearthstone. And it tasted like bread and spring air, and the particular sweetness of things that have been worth the waiting. Marta, from her gate, made no attempt whatsoever to pretend she wasn't watching. "Finally," she said to no one in particular, with the profound satisfaction of a woman whose predictions have once again been entirely vindicated. Bishop barked once in what appeared to be agreement and went back to his gateside investigation, and the lavender moved in the breeze, and Ashvale held them all. The woman who had come home, the man who had waited, the friend who had arrived with soup and stayed for a year, the dog who had no aesthetic preferences but excellent instincts, held them in its old and patient land, which had always known, even when they hadn't, that this was exactly where they were supposed to be. The moonroot bond, which had waited in the soil for 40 years, was complete. And it was enough. It was, in every honest and unhurried way, more than enough. If this story found something real in you, if it was Callis signing her name alone at that table, or Thomas at the fence with the post and no obligation, or the moment she laughed for the first time in that north field, I'd love to know which part stayed with you. Leave it in the comments below. And if you believe, as this land does, that love has no expiration date, that it can find you at 62, at the end of a long road, in a garden that needed tending, then this story was made for you. See you in the next one.